This is Maureen Kafkas, the Brain BS coach, here to tell you about the episode today. In this episode, I talked to sexual and pleasure coach Danielle Savory about the art of receiving, about why receiving is so important, what the challenges are associated with it, and how we can practice it more so we can create more abundance in our lives. For the purpose of this podcast, we primarily focused on pleasure through the senses and not so much on sexual pleasure, but she is definitely coming back on the podcast. She already agreed to it, and we will be talking about sexual pleasure on that one, and I will let you know when that is coming. So here you go. Sit back, settle in. Episode number 136 of the Brain BS podcast, The Art of Receiving with Danielle Savory. Do you want more out of your life but not exactly sure what that might be? Are you longing for something but can't quite put your finger on what it is? That is the universe speaking to you, and it is time to listen up. I'm your host, Maureen Kafkas, the Brain BS coach. I created the Brain BS podcast to help people define what success means to them and show them how to get it. I help you to let go of fear and doubt and prepare your nervous system for success. I show you how to understand your own energy and to trust yourself to make all the decisions. If you are ready to go inward and stop looking outside yourself for all the answers, this is the podcast for you. Now let's get started. Hello and welcome back to the Brain BS podcast. I have a coach with me today that I'm really excited to introduce to you. I'm actually going to let her introduce herself, but the topic we're going to talk about is really exciting and it's way overdue and everybody needs to listen to this episode.
Yes. Well, my name is Danielle Savory and I'm so pleasured to be here. Thank you for having me. And I am a sexual and pleasure coach for women. So that's what I do. So receiving is a huge part of it, but I didn't start out as a sex and pleasure coach, which I'm sure we'll get into a little bit more of that. But really my background's in neuroscience. So Brain BS is like right on board with what I do, and receiving all of the good in our life is a huge passion of mine, including the pleasure.
Great. Well, so I'm excited to get to the topic, but I kind of like to ask people when they come on the podcast, what brought them to coaching?
Yeah. So what brought me to coaching, I've been a coach now for about 10 years. And before that, I was teaching meditation and teaching mindfulness. So I was in that world of healing. But prior to that, that's really where I feel like all of the coaching kind of started. And I was dealing with a lot of chronic pain and a lot of health issues. I was recently married and I was basically bedridden for 2 years. And so there was, moments where, it's not that I couldn't do anything, but it was hard. Just normal activities of daily living were really hard. And it was this really dark period of my life. And I started to try and seek out, like, I can't live my life like this. Like, this is not going to work for me. What is happening? All of these like worries and anxiety and fears. And my best friend encouraged me to go to yoga. And I was like, I can't even shower. Like, how am I supposed to go to a yoga class? She's like, your teacher will take care of you. Just go take a mat. And finally, with a bunch of bullying from her, loving bullying, I finally went. And I remember this teacher telling me as I was laying there on my mat, she's like, just close your eyes, pay attention to your breath. And that's all you have to do. And even though I studied Buddhist psychology in college, that was my minor, I never actually meditated. I never did the practices. I just understood kind of the psychology of it. But right then in that moment, as I was following my breath, I realized how loud and vitriol what was going on in my brain was. And it was such a huge light bulb moment for me, because it was that noticing of the difference of thoughts that my brain was having versus that lived experience in that story. And so I went really deep. I started pulling out my old neuroscience books, finding meditation teachers, finding mindfulness practices. And then I wanted to take it much deeper than that. And that's what led me to coaching.
Oh, I love that. And you know what? One of my favorite things that you said, because I think people really need to hear it, is your minor was in Buddhist theology, did you say?
Psychology, yeah. Buddhist philosophy and psychology, yeah.
So you learned all that, but you didn't actually apply it.
Yes,
right?
Exactly.
Which I know from doing your course means you're not fully actively receiving if you learn something and then you don't implement it.
Yeah.
And that's what we're going to talk about today. I'm just calling it the art of receiving because that's what your course is. And I
Yeah.
love that name because I
Yeah.
do kind of think it's an art. And I think it's something that people don't really realize they need to be doing. And we will talk about it
Yeah.
within the realm of sex, but we're going to talk about all kinds of receiving of pleasure.
Yes. Yes, exactly. And it's exactly what you said, right? It's like we can go and learn all of the things, but if we're not actually applying them or having them shift our mindset or trying these, then they're never actually going to land, which is exactly what I did with the Buddhist psychology. I was also just trying to get a degree and learn something. So I wasn't trying to have some changes or like practicality out of it. So it wasn't that big of a deal. I was like, this is cool. Like people sit and they meditate. Like that's interesting. But I wasn't going in with the intention of like changing my life and feeling zen. This was more just academics. But if you're listening to this podcast, if you are on the world of personal growth journey, then you definitely want to take what we're talking about and put it into practice.
All right, well, that's a good way so let's start with talking about why it's so important to receive pleasure.
Well, there's a variety of reasons. And one of the things that I like to think of first off is why not? Like pleasure seriously feels good. And I think it's just, why are we rejecting something that could actually make us feel good in the first place? So we can find all of these reasons, but simply asking yourself on the regular, like, why wouldn't I? Like, why wouldn't I lead into this? Why am I choosing, or even if it's a subconscious choice, choosing these other things that are kind of bringing me down and feel like a drag and simply don't make me feel good? So that is the first and foremost reason, is like, why not? Because it feels better. But from a scientifically beneficial place, there's so much that receiving pleasure can do for our actual brain. It can help us be in this responsive mode, which allows us to have so many other areas of our life feel and look the way that we really want them to. When it comes to relationships, when your brain and then therefore your nervous system are in this responsive mode, you can create the kind of connection that you want. You can be in a place where maybe you want to get vulnerable, that maybe you do want to get intimate, that you feel trusting, that you feel loving, that you feel supported. All of those come from having a responsive brain. It allows us to go after big goals. It allows us to try new things. It allows us to feel motivated in our life. All of that comes again from having this brain that is supported, and pleasure is a vehicle that really allows this responsive part of our brain to happen.
Well, I love that. And it's also making me think of the opposite of that would be a reactive brain. And typically
Yes.
when we're in reactive mode, we're not really living consciously. We're not choosing how we want to respond. It's just coming out of us. And I
Yes.
actually did an episode not that long ago. I called it Wise Up. And it was Terrence Real, who wrote the book Us, talks about these parts of us, the non-responsive brain and the reactive brain. And he calls the the reactive one, he calls it the maladaptive child self.
Yep.
And the responsive is the wise adult self. So that right there, the way you participate in your relationships is going to be totally different if you're willing to receive.
Yes, if you're willing to receive. And let's be clear here too, like you can have an impact on your relationship in a positive way without having to focus on receiving in that relationship to begin with. So what I mean by that is when we allow ourselves to open up and to receive pleasure in a variety of our areas of our life, what you're doing is you're actually getting to the heart of what's going on. You're getting to the qualities and the traits that are in your brain, like the way that we want to show up. Maybe you want to show up confidently or boldly or courageously or calmly or understanding and more accepting. These are qualities and traits that perhaps you're aspiring to be more of or having more fully expressed. And you don't have to do that right in your relationship, but if you're receiving, you're going to have greater access to these qualities and traits that then can be expressed in your relationship.
Right. So that kind of reminds me of I don't know, I think the law of reciprocity, the universal law, where what you put out comes back to you, but not necessarily from the place where you put it out.
Yes.
Yeah, so it's like
Yes.
all kind of tied together and all sort of
Mhm.
flows. Okay, so is there any, I think you did a pretty good job of explaining why it's important. Do you
Mhm.
want to talk now about why it's so challenging?
Yeah. I mean, one other thing I want to say really quick about when
Mhm.
it's important is one thing that I don't think that we think of a lot about like receiving and allowing ourselves to open up to receive. Not only does it create more trusting and like reciprocities in our relationship, but it also creates resilience. Like I really like to think of it as this buffer system, almost like taking your vitamins. It's like my immune system's going to be stronger and more able and capable of, taking on any kind of illness or allergy or something like that that comes on. It's the same thing with like our nervous system and our brain. The more that we can pull in these good experiences, the more that we can pull in pleasure and, really reinforce all of these traits and the qualities, the more resilient we are going to be when things are hard. The easier it will be to bounce back. Because if you think of something that's like frail or frazzled or anything along those lines, there's not a lot of resilience there. Like if you're operating kind of what I like to think of like as this simmer level and in your stress cycle a lot of the time and you're going to be more easily triggered to start with, but you're also going to have a lot harder time where you're already feeling like overwhelmed and burnout. And then something big and challenging happens in your life. That's going to feel like, oh my God, this might be the thing that breaks me. And so bringing in, even when things are going really good, actively feeling like you're receiving to bring it in is also setting you up for when things might not be going as easily or as great or big challenges in life come up. So you really are kind of building up a reserve and a buffer system for the hard in your life.
Okay, well, if we haven't talked the audience into thinking it's important to receive by now, then I'm not sure.
That was the censure.
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, so why don't you talk now about why it's so difficult, why it's so challenging to receive?
Yeah, well, I think everybody has different backgrounds. I coach a lot of women, and so specifically for women, just the way that we are socialized, there isn't a lot of emphasis on receiving. We're really encouraged more to be the givers. And not only are we encouraged to be the givers and to be the nurturers and to put other people's needs and pleasures and egos even above our own, we also are taught to be humble, to not take up space, to don't be selfish. And so when you look at these two messages, both of those are very anti-receiving. So it's like, I got to be the giver. I got to think of everybody else. I got to take care of everybody else. And then on the flip side, it also feels a little bit dangerous to receive because am I being selfish? Am I taking up too much space? Am I putting too much attention on me and not on other people? And so, just from our socialization, and this isn't just for women, but mostly for the way that women are socialized in our culture, those are the messages that we're getting. And beyond the socialization, we have different neurodivergence. We might have different experiences like trauma and traumatic events that have like an impact on our nervous system where it feels kind of scary to open up and receive. It feels, and again, this is not conscious. It's not like you're conscious, like, oh, I'm so afraid of receiving. This is just happening. It's happening in the background. It's the way your nervous system is playing out. It's the way that your brain's playing out. So if you're hearing any of this, you're like, I'm not choosing that. You're not a masochist. It's just happens in the back operating system when we're not paying attention. We don't have that awareness. So, things like our neurodivergence, our past traumas and experiences, the way that we've been socialized, and also then just generational messages that have been passed down that might have been encouraging us to really focus more on giving and thinking again that receiving wasn't for us or it could even be dangerous.
Yeah, I think that's important to note because I think the emotional safety piece of it
Yeah.
is that it does honestly, when you start taking care of yourself, because I'm actually doing that right now in my life,
Mhm.
and it's
Yeah.
creating a lot of discomfort for everybody, including myself, a good kind,
Yeah.
because I'm working towards receiving, making myself a priority. And I gave a lot over the years, but it wasn't giving is so I think this is important to know too. And I think I remember
Yeah.
this from your podcast or your course. Giving is not just giving. If you're doing it with resentment and you're
Yeah.
getting bitter and you have like all these emotions coming up when you're doing it, that's not really the true, meaning of giving. Giving is when you
Yes.
give from your heart. And when you start to try to do this and stop the people pleasing and say things that are uncomfortable, it really at first it feels very unsafe. But it is a form of receiving when you do that for yourself.
Exactly. Exactly. And I love what you brought up in the giving, because this is such an important point for us to understand, is that can be such an additional barrier for us to receive, is what our perceived impression is of the intention behind what is being given to us. Because if we get into this habit and we get into this cycle of giving, but like you said, Maureen, like if it's giving from this place of like obligation or duty, or I just have to, then we subconsciously develop this feeling that, oh, this other person must also be doing this because they want something from me, or because they are just doing it so that I'm happy, or that I feel good, or so that they can get something in return. And you can see this especially in intimate relationships and with women, right? Like, oh yeah, I did see that you helped out with the kids or you cleaned the kitchen, but it's only because you want something from me later, right? And it's this idea that we're doing, that the giver, the intentions aren't for our benefit, but so that they can get something from us. And so really where we can start is by starting to take stock of how am I giving? Like, where is that really coming from? Is it coming from this place of almost like, well, I'm going to do this for you so that I get this response from you. I get this behavior from you. I get you to do something more for me so that you like me. All of these things where it's attached, and that giving comes from this place of attachment rather than I am simply just doing this unattached, not expecting anything in return. That in turn will allow you to receive from much a more trusting place, because you are being in congruence with the way that you want to receive.
Yeah, because if you're thinking that your partner or whoever in any
Yeah.
relationship, if you're thinking, well, what are they up to? They're
Mm-hmm.
they're trying to get something. The only reason you would be doing that is because you're projecting what's going on in your brain. So if you're
Totally.
that's like a red flag for anyone listening. If you're doing that all the time to other people, it's because you are not genuinely giving from the heart. You wouldn't think
Exactly.
that they aren't if you weren't experiencing it yourself. Now it's different. Like sometimes you just know and you can assess things.
Yeah.
But I'm
Yeah.
talking about if it's bothering you and it's a habitual pattern of thinking whenever someone's going to give you something that you think they're like, I mean, we've all been around those people that are
Yeah.
just like, what's your angle? Why are you
Yeah.
doing, you know?
Yeah, yeah, you can feel it, right? It's an energetic feel. And so we really want to be in a place, and the more that you can give from this place of like genuine like congruence with what you want, versus like getting grasping and getting something in turn, but because like I want to do this, I really genuinely want to. It's not obligation, duty, responsibility, or trying to get like some sort of response from you. Then it's going to be easier for you to trust that other people are also doing that.
Yeah. And something else too that I learned from you is that in order to create abundance in your life, you have to be able to receive. It
Yeah.
can't come to you if you're like guarded, protecting yourself, suspicious of other people. It's like literally because like attracts like. You can't reel it in or bring it in
Mhm.
when you are not in a position and have a nervous system to receive.
Yes. Yes, exactly. And the thing is like when it comes to abundance, like let's say it's money, it's not that you can't get money, but usually it leaves just as quickly as it comes if you're not in this place of like genuinely receiving it, because you're not open to it, right? It's like saying thank you to somebody without allowing their words to really land. So if somebody says, "Oh my gosh, I love your haircut," and you're like, "Thanks." And then in the background, you're thinking like, they didn't really mean that. What's going to come next? And you're not like really receiving their words and like letting them land and feel good. Then it just kind of bounces off. Like you're going through the action, but it's just kind of bounced off. And it's the same kind of thing with like abundance. Like we might be doing all of these actions, but if we're not truly open to receiving and having this softening and this place in our body and showing up in that way, then even you might have some actions that create some abundance that come back to you, but you'll probably quickly notice how those go away because you don't feel safe to bring it in, like bring it into your life and bring it into the self concept of who you are.
Yeah, and you also said that if you really want something in your life, I think you said this, if you really want something in your life and you don't have it, it's because you're not able to receive it.
Mm.
So,
I don't know
and
if I said that, but I agree with that in a lot of ways.
yeah,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
getting to a point of being able to receive it,
Mhm.
and has a lot of layers to it, right? And a lot of levels, and it requires some personal work and thought work, reprogramming your subconscious, releasing your emotions, and
Mhm.
not keeping everything squashed down. But
Yep.
yeah, so it's like, so if you're thinking, like for me, I ended up uh taking a break from everything and really diving into human design and figuring out who I am in this, like, in this world. What am I trying to do? And
Mhm.
let go of all the ideas that other people put into my head about what I was trying to do. And then when
Mhm.
I was able to come back to that and do that, I was able to realize that I couldn't receive before because I didn't have a nervous system to support success. I did start
Yeah.
bringing in the money and the clients, and I was just like, oh, like it was just like, there's no way I can sustain this. So I had to do a lot of work on my nervous system to be in a
Mhm.
place where I'm working on a course now. So this year will be the first time that I actually tried to sell anything in over like 2 years. So I'm so
Yeah.
excited to see what happens and not attached to anything. Because I know
Yeah.
abundance is going to come in some way, right? It's not necessarily money, but I just really want people to understand how much that nervous system and being able to support success, it's critical.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it also, it goes beyond just being able to bring it in. But, when we think about these big goals and these big dreams, there are behaviors and actions that we can take to make them more inevitable. And when we come back to this responsive versus reactive brain, when you are practicing receiving and your nervous system isn't supported and you don't have that resilience, when you do get that first no, it's a lot harder to bounce back. When you do, start feeling like burnt out because you're kind of operating in this reactive stress mode all of the time, you're not going to feel motivated most days to get up and show up the way that you want to be showing up in the world. So it really does come back down to like the very just basic way that receiving supports the way that you want to show up. So it isn't just like this energetic thing, it is also supporting the actions that you want to be taking in the world.
Yeah. Yeah. So, all right. Well, so is there anything else that we want to say on that before we kind of share some ways for people to practice receiving?
The other thing that I would just say is just to acknowledge again, our brains operate with a natural negativity bias. And I think that's really important when we're like, again, like, why am I not receiving all the good stuff? Like, your brain has a hard time seeing the good stuff. Like, if you do something really well, it has a hard time seeing the thing that you did really well versus the five things that you kind of messed up on, right? And this isn't something, again, you're doing on purpose. This truly is a negativity bias because it helped with our survival. It helped us, out in the wild survive. Because if we had this idea like, oh, this is out to get me, you're way more likely to be cautious and, not put yourself in front of a poisonous snake instead of like assuming there's nothing there to ever get you. And so our brain evolutionarily speaking, was, developed with this on purpose. And so it actually takes a practice. Like you can't passively go through and expect to receive the good or pay attention to it, or even listening to this podcast, you're like, okay, I'm going to pay attention to the good. No, it's an actual active practice. And because it takes effort, the brain's going to resist it. The brain would rather have you marinate on all the stuff that's not working instead of the progress you are making, instead of the things that are going well, instead of the beautiful things that you have in your relationship, whatever it might be, because it's like that's going to take a lot of effort, because it does. It's going against its natural bias, which is to focus on the negative. So this has to be intentional. It has to be a practice. It is a skill that you develop, and you will keep being intentional with it forever. It's not like it just happens and, oh, I got so used to celebrating myself and feeling good and absorbing in all of the good stuff, and then I'm done. No, you're not. You still have to look out and intentionally bring that stuff in order for it to have an impact on you.
And the negativity bias also comes in when, because I talked about universal law on the podcast too,
Yeah.
like the law of polarity. When you're desperate, like I was just like desperate for more clients, and I was desperate that I thought I had to make 100K that first year, and
Yeah.
so much pressure on myself and everything. But I would sit there and kind of pray for this stuff out of desperation or whatever.
Yeah.
I think that my prayers weren't getting answered.
Mm-hmm.
Until I stopped and I slowed down and I realized the universe didn't think I was ready for all those clients and for that money. So they were giving me a pivot, but I was overlooking it because I couldn't even see it because of the lens of how I was so focused on what I thought I needed that I wasn't present enough to take the gifts that were right in front of me. And for me, that ended up being human design, and really diving into that, and started all these other things. But I picked up human design and then set it down because I was like, yeah, that's good. That's nice. But then it was actually going back to it. And then really, it was an invitation, really, what it was, not having the nervous system for success or being able to receive all of it. It was an invitation to really do some deep work on myself and become more aware. And yeah, and it isn't easy and it does take effort, but it's like the best work you'll ever do.
Exactly. Well, and I love this point that you brought up, Maureen, is like the openness, right? Like that's another part of receiving, is like the openness. And because like when we're trying to control what we're receiving, when we're trying to be attached on what we're receiving, that's when you're not really open to receiving, because you're like have this fixated idea, and we can't be open to what it is we're actually supposed to receive, or the good that could be out there, because we're so narrowly fixated in on what we think we're trying to receive.
Yeah. And Eckhart Tolle, one of other people have said it, but I read it in his book, is everything's happening for me, not to me.
Yeah.
Really becomes a way of life when you look at it that way. It requires a lot of trust, and it does require detachment. But if you can look at it that way, it's the same skill for looking at the good things in life. It's like being able to reframe things in a way that works for you is everything. I mean, it's the difference between having peace of mind and joy in a fulfilling life, or thinking that nothing's going the way it should be and it's always lack and scarcity.
Yeah. And I think such an important point with all of this is like, even though we know that there's good stuff, like you hear about the gratitude journal and pulling in all these good things and seeing that this is for me and like learning those lessons, this doesn't mean gaslight yourself out of your experience. And when we're already in an emotion, like if you have disappointment, like you're supposed to have disappointment, like we don't immediately have to jump to looking at how like the good in this or the lesson in this. And I think that sometimes we can get caught in like that, like feeling then shame, like I should be able to just see the good. I should just be on board. I should see how this is for me. And I think like, especially if you're a woman listening to this, this is a place my brain always went, because it's like, oh my gosh, I'm doing it wrong. I'm doing it wrong. Like, no, feel your feels. And then once you've allowed yourself to process the emotion, that's already there. If you're already having an emotion like disappointment or rejection or embarrassment or whatever it might be, be with that first. Like that is the way that we receive. We don't receive by like being filled up with all of this uncomfortable stuff and then trying to put something positive on it. What you want to do is clear the vessel, and the only way that we clear that vessel so we can receive the good stuff is to start by processing what's there. So give yourself first a chance to like process the disappointment, the shame, the rejection, the sadness, the grief, whatever is there first, and then that's when we get to start like, how else could I look at this? And we get to be curious and we get to open up to receiving the good, but it doesn't come from pretending that something else that happened might not have been feeling good or isn't good to start with.
Yeah, no, I'm really glad that you pointed that out. I also want to offer though that when this is just my practice, and if it works for me,
Yeah.
I'm sure it will work for someone else. When something emotional happens, and I've had a very emotional last couple months, when it happens, it just for me, if I put my hand on my heart and I say, I know this is happening for me, even though it's so painful right now and I'm feeling this, and then I feel all the feels. For me,
Yeah.
just remembering, but that I'm also very like uh,
You've
spiritual.
done a lot of this work. Yeah.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
for me
And you've
it,
done
it
a lot of the work. Yeah.
yeah,
And
so
for me, I'm more dramatic and I'm very reactive. And so when I do that particular practice, and that's why you have to take this and try it. Like everybody has to try and see what works for you. Cause it's like when I do that, my brain's like, no, it's not. Like this isn't for, it's like it gets like angrier. So you have to know how it works. Like for me, I also like love to put my hand on my heart. I'm like, oh, this is a hard moment, woman. I can see this. This is really challenging. I love you. I got you. Other people go through hard stuff too. And I give myself just that space to like not go anywhere positive, but still hold it lovingly. So when you're listening to this, like I love that Maureen and I are both offering these two different ways because we find out what works with us. But what we're both saying is give yourself a chance to feel the feels. We're not trying to get rid of those ever.
no. And the other thing we're saying is that it's everybody's responsibility to figure out what works for them, to really get to know themselves, to find their own path in their own journey. It absolutely has to include feeling feelings, because no amount of thought work
No.
is going to reprogram your subconscious. It's just not possible. And
No.
it actually, I think, adds even more suffering, because you're like, oh my God, I'm thinking the way I'm supposed to. And that this thought should
Why
create
don't I
this
feel
feeling.
better?
And
Yeah.
yeah, and it's like, so no. All right. I think we got the message very clear that they should feel their feelings and not
Yes.
try to think their way out of it. So now let's share, because I always like to give people some tools and things to do right after they're done listening to the podcast. So what are some ways they can practice receiving?
Yeah. So I think that the best way, being a sensual coach is always to tap into the five senses. There's always something that we can receive in the five senses at any given time, and really turning toward what lights you up, what feels pleasing, what looks good. So you can look around you. I go on walks all the time. And so like I love to go on these walks and really like soak in like the thing that I'm drawn to, the things that are beautiful for me. I do live in the Pacific Northwest. Like there's so much beauty around me all of the time. So really just like pulling in that beauty, something that smells good, your first sip of coffee or tea. I'm a big tea drinker and I'm obsessed right now, by the way. Side note, if you're a tea drinker, Smith Tea Makers, which is also here in Portland, they have a tea called Black Lavender, and it is divine. And the smell of it will just like light your whole body up. And so I'll just sit and just really just like drink in the aroma and let myself really pay attention to that aroma, what you're hearing, listening to music that lights you up, listening to the birds chirping, like letting yourself like absorb and receive the goodness of something you can hear, what you're tasting, what you're feeling. So the senses are always such a very easily accessible way to receive on the daily. And again, remember, receiving as a practice. So the more that you can practice, so this can just be one of your practices. And then we can have like interrelationship practices, with practicing receiving compliments, really like, thank you. Like, I received that, which I learned from my dear friend and colleague, Maggie Reyes. She taught me that phrase, like, I received that. And I use it all of the time, like reminding myself that I am receiving that and bringing it in. Those are two really good ways to start receiving and paying attention to what does my body need in order to receive? So, kind of the things that we talked about at the beginning of the podcast: feeling safe, feeling open to it, feeling curious, not being attached, and creating that kind of environment in your body so that you can receive pleasure, touch, appreciation, adoration, all these other good things that you could really focus on, especially in like your personal and intimate relationships.
Yeah, so another book that Maggie Reyes told me about is well, she told me about us also, but she told me about why talking is not enough. The 8 loving actions. And
Mhm.
I thought about this when we were getting ready to meet, because the number 5 is balancing giving and taking. So if you're
Mm.
in a relationship with someone and it's always feeling like you're the one that's doing all the giving, whatever energy you're giving from, even if you're always giving, I think a lot of people or women that I've talked to kind of at a certain level think that's admirable, and that they're doing something for the benefit of their family, and they're willing to sacrifice themselves,
Mhm.
for their family. And I really want to talk about that a little bit, because that's not, if I for me it's like a worthiness, or not worthiness, because we're all worthy, but of you thinking you're worthy, that
Mhm.
I think it's so important that you have to be able to receive. It's not something that you can just decide to be a martyr,
Mhm.
or,
Yeah.
sacrifice yourself so that your family
Yeah.
gets to do all the receiving. You're not really helping anybody when you do that.
Yeah. And I think the thing is to think about receiving is like, we always think that there's like, when you brought up the word take, that by receiving, we're taking something from someone, when really you can think of like receiving is actually a giving to someone else. Like when I'm cuddling my children in the morning, like we have this every single night and every single morning, I cuddle my children, and I have every day for 11 and a half years. Right. So it's like, that is a really special time. And I actively practice receiving like their touch and their love. And like, even if they're not saying like, oh, mom, I love you and I appreciate you, like I am receiving appreciation because I just feel it, but I'm not taking anything from them by receiving. And so I think that that is another one of those kind of where tension happens, is when we are practicing receiving, assuming that we're taking because we're receiving from other people, and not seeing it as this like, oh, I'm taking this from you, but like I am open to receiving. That is way different than taking. And that can help us get into this place. Like, you start with like the small moments, like start with receiving, like I said, these things from our senses. And then you, in your relationships, receiving things like touches or like things that are already offered that maybe you're not paying attention to. My husband always takes out the garbage. Like I can receive that. You're like, oh, it's so clean in here. It's so nice. He's taking out the garbage, even though it's not like I'm taking something from him because he's done this thing that's his responsibility to take out the garbage. But we can practice in those ways as you're building up to receiving things that might be a little bit more uncomfortable for you.
Yeah, I remember that was one of the ways that you said, being mindful of what you're doing and really taking it in. I believe you also said that we have the negativity bias of how we look at things, but it
Mhm.
also has a greater imprint on our nervous system. So when we are in a position to actually receive, how it really has to be a practice, and you have to like really, really take it in
Yeah.
to get more of that.
Yes. Yeah. You have to let it like land because it's so fleeting. My teacher, and where I learned a lot of this from, is Rick Hansen. And he talks about like how, you know, the negative, like we are like a Teflon for the positive and Velcro for the negative. Like we'll naturally just like Velcro on to like negative things and just naturally repel positive things. So we have to actively take it in, and then creating these experiences where we're marinating in it, because we don't give that much airtime to it. And because we're naturally more repellent to it, we have to like actually pretend we're like marinating and soaking in the good, which means that you have to bring it up more often to your brain. Even if these things aren't happening all the time, you can recall them in your memory. You can create the experience in your body. You can feel that appreciation just by recalling something, where a time where you felt appreciated, and then giving that airtime, giving that equal airtime, if not more airtime, to ways that you might be stressing or feeling bad or negative.
All right. Well, I feel like we've given the audience really good reason to learn how to receive, that you've
Yes.
explained to them why it's challenging. So if they think it's hard for them, they're no different than anybody else. It's challenging in different ways for all of us. And
Yeah.
we've been conditioned not to make it, especially us women. And then you've given them some ways for them to practice it. Is there any other? There was one thing that you said, it's kind of goes with mindfulness, but I kind of liked it and I did it, is linking to a daily habit. I think it's a good way to start, of like when they brush their teeth and just getting super into like being, and I have an occupational therapy background. So for me, and I did it, activities of daily living is what I taught people how to do in the hospital. So for me, sometimes I'll just be like, oh, I have my pinch. I have my motor coordination to brush my teeth. I can open, the container or whatever, just anything where you can actively receive and create some gratitude in the mundane, right? Like it really is about bringing all this to the ordinary and mundane. It doesn't have to be these big
Extra. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's so important, is like, how can I receive in my daily life, with my senses, with something that I'm always already doing, and that will help it be more of a habit that will create, this habitual practice that then allows you to create the skill set to be able to receive in other areas.
Well, you reminded me that how much I love music. And I love singing, and I am terrible. And anybody who's heard me will tell you that I am really bad at singing. But since I did your courses, whenever I get in the car now, I no longer listen to podcasts. And I remembered after like 3 years in my amazing sports car convertible that I could hook up Spotify to my phone. So I was so limited in what I was listening to on the radio, because I had one of those little whatever USB things or whatever in the car. And then I like this whole world opened up to me with just a shift in my thinking. I'm like, oh my God, I could listen to anything and everything I want on Spotify in my car. So I really did go from lack to abundance just by getting in my car and turning on the music.
Yes, yes, I love it. It's so fun. Music can be such an immediate way to receive pleasure.
Oh yeah, I just love music. So okay, well, is there anything that we did not? I think I also learned another question. I like questions, so I just want to bring up a question that people can ask themselves, and it's ask yourself, in what way am I already abundant in my life?
Yes, yes.
And really try to focus on that instead of, because a lot of us, when we want something, myself included, I have been guilty of this in the past. When I really wanted something, all I could think about was what I didn't want.
Yeah.
And why I didn't want it. And I couldn't focus, like couldn't get my nervous system to focus on what was so great and so good already. And we want that result. We want that external result to try to make us feel that way, but that's not how it works.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that you bring up such a good point of just like, it's so much easier to think of the things that we don't want instead of the things that we do. But when we force our brain to like actively think of the things that we do want, then you can start turning towards them.
Yeah. And it's a practice. Like all of this is a practice. It's not, it doesn't come naturally at first, and there's resistance, and it's just like, for me, it's like, okay, I'm not gonna keep working today. I'm going to go for a walk because my legs hurt. from sitting in the chair, and I'm doing this, and I'm going to receive like fresh air and a walk in nature. So yeah, it's so much more fun to live this way.
Yes, it really is. It's more fun. And you get to still do like the big, huge dreams and goals, and you get to do them easier because now you're supported and you're taken care of, and you're not going to burn out trying to hustle to it.
Yeah. Okay, well, do you have any final word? Oh, you have to tell people if they want to work with you. Tell them about your business and what you do and how they can get in touch with you, and we'll put all the stuff in the show notes.
Yeah, so like Maureen said, she took a course called The Art of Receiving that is not sex related. So if you're interested in that, we'll put that in the show notes. But other than that, you can find, I'm on Instagram at The Practice of Pleasure. So I talk a lot about pleasure. Some of it's sexual, some of it's not. So there's both in there. And, if you want to work with me, you could take a look at daniellesavory.com. I have, do it yourself courses. I have group coaching, private, and then fun little workshops every once in a while.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being here. As soon as I heard you in our coaching group, and I didn't get to make it that day.
Yeah.
In the marriage MBA program. As soon as I listened to it, I was like, oh, I'm totally checking her out. Like I just knew instantly that you had something I was interested in. I'm also going to go check out your courses and the other things that you have, because I always like trust my intuition. And when and I've been waiting for you to come on here, not like desperately waiting.
Yeah.
But I've been
waiting to receive open. Oh yeah. And I have a podcast too. I didn't say that. The Practice of It's My Pleasure is the podcast. So it's all about receiving your pleasure.
Yeah. So you just reminded me too about your podcast, because I haven't been listening, because it's like you have to practice receiving, and you have to be intentional about where you're receiving from.
Yes.
Right? You want it to fill you up and light you up, not.
Yeah. Because we can receive like the criticism all day. That's not what we're talking about here.
No. All right, audience. I know you learned something valuable here today. I'll see you next episode. Thanks for being here and learning about Brain BS. I hope you enjoyed listening to the episode as much as I enjoyed creating it for you. If you did, please take a little time to do a quick review, give me 5 stars, and share it with everyone you know. If you're actually interested in being on the podcast yourself or have questions about it, you can find me in the Brain BS podcast community on Facebook. See you next time.